record of December 8th, 2022. And we'll start with an overview of the public comment process, as you can see on your screen. For those participating remotely, we can take written questions or comments. You can email your public comments and questions to the email shown. In your request, please indicate whether that goes with a particular agenda item. If you prefer oral comments and questions, use the raise hand function in Zoom or send an email. And then also say which agenda item you would like to provide comments on, and then wait until prompted for that opportunity. And when you give your public comment, feel free to introduce yourself by stating your name and affiliation. That's optional. All right, moving on, then now we just do the roll call of the members. And remember, for the roll call, you are giving your name and whether you have any conflicts of interest to declare. So, Steve.
Steve Brandt, nothing to disclose.
Virginia.
Virginia Dale, no new conflicts.
Tanya.
Anya Heikela, I have one new declaration. I have been invited to participate in the next version of the State of the Bay Delta Science Project report, and I'll be focused on the chapter on climate change governance.
Tom.
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
And Anna Michalak is running late. She'll be here in a minute. Oh, no, there's Anna. Go ahead.
Hi, Anna Michalak, no new conflicts.
And I believe Diane is also going to have to join us late, so we'll skip her. Bob.
Bob Nyman, no new conflicts.
Obey.
Jayant Obey-Sekar, no new conflicts.
And I'm Lisa Wainger, no new conflicts. And Inga.
Inga Werner, no new conflicts.
All right, thanks everyone. So let me just give you a quick overview of the agenda. It's an exciting meeting for those of us who've really been digging into the review of the environmental impact report, which is pretty much everyone. So here we are, almost done, and we're here to mostly talk about whether everyone approves the content, what we want to change, and any new changes we want to suggest. But it does feel like we're getting near the end, and it's going to be a big celebration to get through finishing this review, because people really have put in a lot of hours, and I'm really grateful to everyone for really digging in and looking for issues with the science. The other things, but there are other things on the agenda. So there's, I'm going to give a chair's report. We're going to discuss one of the ongoing reviews or activities that we shorthandedly call the futures activity. And then once we're done with the environmental impact discussion, we'll start talking about our next activities. So it's time for us to develop our work plan for the year ahead. And, you know, I know there's a lot of really interesting ideas floating around about reviews we might do or other activities to advance the science for Delta management. And so we'll start getting into that conversation. I do want to point out, we have, since we created this agenda, two members have let us know, two East Coast members have let us know that they need to leave probably at our lunch break. So if at all possible, I'd like to see if we can keep our discussion of the EIR review to the morning, and then try to do our vote before those two members leave. If that's not possible, if we haven't gotten through everyone's comments, we will take the time, but I just want to put that in people's head that if we want to have everyone voting, it would be nice if we could get there before lunch. All right, let's dig in to the chair's report. Oh, are there any public comments?
There are none.
Okay, moving forward. Agenda item 2, chair's report and business matters. So first off, we have with us today Allegra LaFair, the Sea Grant State Fellow, who's been providing ISB staff support, and she concluded her fellowship early on November 28th and has moved to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And you know, we're really grateful to the many roles that Allegra played when she was here. She got a very broad view of important science topics and environmental management issues, as opposed to just digging into one thing. she was instrumental in our outreach and communications. She really made sure that things were available to the public in a timely manner. She helped create the summary sheet for the monitoring enterprise review that helped communicate those findings, and just has really been a great supporter of public accessibility. She was also just our real go-to when it came to keeping the EIR review straight. So she did quite a lot of project coordination, and we are not the easiest group. So she was able to keep track of our comments and how to integrate our comments and things like that. So she's been a huge help. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Allegra right now and just let her share some of her reflections.
Thank you, Lisa. So kind of you. I am going to share my screen, and I have a little short presentation for you. I'm going to assume you can see my screen. Feel free to speak up if you can't. So first, I just wanted to say hello. It's great to see you all again. I know I finished my fellowship just a few weeks ago, but it already feels a little bit like a lifetime. I'm happy to be back and reflect on some of the skills and experiences I gained this past year as a California State Sea Grant Fellow with the Delta Stewardship Council. So right off the bat, this fellowship was an intense crash course in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I started my fellowship with the ISB by helping to wrap up a few reviews, including the Monitoring Enterprise Review and the Water Supply Reliability Review. So I helped push a few reviews out the door, and then was fortunate to sit in and listen into some of the early meetings and scoping discussions about subsidence reversal and environmental flows, which were both totally new topics to me. Additionally, many of those initial public meetings in the first few months of my fellowship highlighted presentations from experts in and around the Delta. And all of those kind of beginning experiences combined gave me a great overview of some of the science and policy happening right now in the Delta. I also learned the basics of how public meetings are run and got a glimpse behind the scenes, got to pull back the curtain a little bit and saw everything that makes into one of these meetings run smoothly. So while my fellowship this year was remote, I was fortunate to visit Sacramento in the first few months of my fellowship for both the April ISB field tour, which was the first in-person meeting since the beginning of the pandemic. That was really exciting to meet all of you in person. And it was also, I also went on a whirlwind 3-day tour of the Delta hosted by the Water Education Foundation in May. Both of these trips gave me really important context and helped me gain an appreciation for the complex and beautiful ecosystem that is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So it was kind of fellowship as usual until the morning of July 27th, 2022, when at 9:30 a.m., for lack of a better word, my inbox exploded with lots of alerts and updates. And I found out that the Delta Conveyance Project draft environmental impact report from the Department of Water Resources had officially been released to the public. The initial few weeks of organizing, delegating roles and responsibilities, and just overall project management sometimes felt just a little bit like herding cats. But in all seriousness, I learned many important lessons from the EIR coordination and can now confidently add project management to my skill set. Through the coordination process, I learned about meeting planning and facilitation. I honed my editing skills, and I got to be a fly on the wall for lots of interesting scientific discussions. Outside of my ISB duties, I also took on a lot of other roles and broadened my professional skill set. As part of the adaptive management unit, I helped with meeting planning and facilitation for a number of different interagency groups over the course of the year. I also worked with Chelsea Batavia and other members of the science program on an interweaving traditional knowledge and Western science project. So that included leading an internal staff literature review group, which I loved doing. And I also helped to research what other state agencies are doing to incorporate traditional knowledge into their practices or their policy. As a fellow with the Delta Stewardship Council, I also participated in some of the many workshops and events that the program hosts. So you can see kind of a little example of some of those that I participated in on the right. A particularly fun aspect of my fellowship this year was engaging with the broader Sea Grant community over the course of the year. I collaborated on an extension project with the USC Sea Grant and California Sea Grant on a DDT workshop in the spring. You can see a screenshot of our team on the lower left. I attended trainings on meeting facilitation and career development. And I also attended a handful of conferences where I got to meet other Sea Grant fellows. So on the lower right, there's a few fellows and I, and we met Shauna O at the California Seaweed Festival back in the fall. So with that, what's next? What's on the horizon? As Lisa alluded to, I'm happy to announce that I recently started work as an environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm going to be part of their whale safe fisheries unit. It's a newly formed team, and we're going to be developing management strategies that minimize marine mammal entanglement risk in state-managed fixed gear fisheries. I'm only about a week or so into my new position, but I'm already very grateful for the training and experience I had as a Sea Grant Fellow, and it's been a really great jumping off point. Here's just a small glimpse at some of the skills I anticipate using at my new position at CDFW that I gained here at the fellowship. I've already been told that my public meeting experience will come in handy when we host town halls or meetings. So thank you, ISB, for having public monthly meetings. I have a lot of experience with that now. On my first day of work, my new boss and coworker were really excited to hear that I bring accessibility experience, so I can get things posted online promptly and make them accessible. It's kind of already been a feather in my cap. Meeting planning and facilitation, which I've mentioned a handful of times already, is a skill I honed with the incredibly organized adaptive management unit, and is always a useful skill for any job moving forward. And finally, I've seen, oh, sorry, I skipped ahead a bullet point. Learning more about stakeholder engagement and community involvement through the ISB and the science program is another asset that I'm looking forward to bringing to my new position. And finally, I've seen how just having a general knowledge of state government and different agencies, how policy gets enacted, public notices, and other aspects of the policymaking process, all of that's going to be really valuable in my new position going forward. So with that quick presentation, I just wanted to end with a heartfelt thank you. I've learned a lot this year, and I'm excited to start applying some of the lessons that I've learned to a new position. I wanted to give a special thanks to you, ISB members. I also wanted to thank Christine and Lillian, the postdocs. Very excited to have worked with them this year. I wanted to give a shout out to the science program, the ISB support staff, Edmund and Lauren. You are what makes these meetings run every month, and words cannot capture how much effort and dedication and work you both put in. I'd be remiss to not mention the members of the adaptive management team, and I loved working with them, and I'm going to miss them very much. So with that, that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Yeah, that is great, Allegra. I'm glad to see you're really going to put those skills to use on such an important topic of preventing whale entanglement. Let's hear from some others. Steve.
Yeah, the Sea Grant Fellows are an absolutely critical component of how the board does its business. We rely on them in ways we probably shouldn't, because they keep us going. And Allegra has done an absolutely outstanding job in this role. And I really want to thank you, Allegra, for all the help you've given us, and particularly the work with finishing up the monitoring review. You say that lightly, but as you know, it was our largest ever review, and frankly, your help is what made us move it forward and get it done. So, and of course, also with the recent EIR. So you've done an outstanding job. Let us know if we can ever help you, and good luck in your future.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, and I will say with the monitoring enterprise review, it's almost like a carrying of the torch with all of the Sea Grant Fellows. I know Jenica before also helped with the monitoring enterprise review. So I'm happy to just kind of continue that tradition of Sea Grant Fellow support. But thank you so much, Steve, and it's been a pleasure working with you this year.
It's easier to list who wasn't involved with the monitoring enterprise review. So, okay, well, I'm sure these comments that Steve has spoken are shared by many. So we really do appreciate everything you've done. Thumbs ups all around. And yes, we really look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Oh, Tom's got a comment. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to say Allegra's impact will continue because she was very helpful in us getting started with the subsidence review.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really interested to kind of keep following along, I guess now from a distance, from a public perspective, and see how some of these reviews shape up, and to see where the subsidence review goes.
All right. Well, thank you, Allegra.
All right. Well, thank you all. I think that you might move on to your next agenda item. So thank you so much. I'm going to go hop to my other position now and check in on the whales. So
Good work. Take care.
all right. Thank you all.
Okay, very good. And just to round out this discussion, we do have a new state fellow starting soon, and we don't have a start date yet, but we have identified that person, and Tanya helped the DSC folks to pick that person, and we appreciate her input on that. So we're looking forward to getting to our new fellow. Okay, to other business. This one's near and dear to my heart. The chair-elect position is currently empty, and we would like to fill that position. So someone who is willing to start learning the ropes and then become chair in, I guess it's about 1.5 years time. And so please consider if you would like to be nominated for that. This is not, the board runs itself in a lot of ways. It's a lot of really great folks that, as you know, that you're working with. And so it's not, it's really not that hard a job. So I hope that folks will consider, even if you've just joined, I think you're still in the running, because we really just need people who can have a vision and keep us organized and that sort of thing. So, and if we don't get any volunteers, we'll just have to start a draft, I think. So, okay. As part of your meeting package, we received the following general correspondence. We had 4 letters that add to our grand total of 988 letters that have expressed the sentiment that the Delta Conveyance Project is not a solution to drought and climate change. And at this point, we'll see if there are any other public comments on this first topic.
There are none.
Okay, thank you, Edmund. So now we'll move on to agenda item 3, supporting decision-making under deep uncertainty. Also a tongue twister. So it might appear in your agenda under its old name, which is anticipating California futures. So that's the first thing to talk about, is why we changed the name. And yes, I'm glad to see Laurel's popped up. This is a joint effort with the Delta Science Program. And so we have our group formed together to forward this goal. It includes Tanya, Obey, Laurel, Chelsea to date, and we've gotten input from others as well. And I just would like to, so you got a handout, but I want to talk a little bit about that handout, but I also want to tell a little story, because if you'll bear with me, because I still get this feeling that people don't quite understand why we think this is important or how it would be used. And I've been looking for an example, and I think I heard a good one, and you'll tell me if it resonates. So first of all, we wanted to change the name to Science Supporting Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty, because the old title was confusing to people. It overlapped with prior activities that didn't have the same goals. So we had been avoiding the term deep uncertainty because it's kind of jargony sounding. But what we mean by that is just, as we've said in the past, it's just uncertainty that you can't really quantify very well, that people don't agree on, and that you can't really reduce through a couple years of research. So things that are just tough to really be sure how often they're going to happen, but still are potentially important. So now to the story, and I apologize that this story is not California specific, but I do think the gist of the story is still useful for crystallizing the motivation of this. So some of, and Obey will probably be familiar with the story because it's about Florida. So I was listening to some people involved in insurance and finance, and they were explaining that the climate models used to predict likely property damage in Florida have already been found to be conservative estimates of damage in the past decade. Those models were based on long-term probabilities, which is how this is done. On average in any given year, what's the probability you're going to have a major hurricane? But Florida got, as this was said in an informal setting, I don't know that some of these things are 100% accurate, but as was said, Florida got 3 200-year events in 3 years. And that person was referring to Hurricane Hermine, Irma, Hurricanes Hermine, Irma, and Michael. Irma and Michael were much bigger hurricanes, but Hermine was still noticeable because it came after an 11-year gap in storms. So, after 11 years without a major hurricane, certain behaviors became more common. So they got this compounding of hurricanes. Then there were new financial risks to the insurance industry, specifically because of new legislation that caused a lot of new lawsuits. So that cost them a lot of money. So insurers were thinking in terms of this, nice distribution of annual expected probabilities, the way, and what they found was that their financial risk was much higher than they predicted because of this unlikely timing of events and its co-occurrence with this social effect of new legislation. And I think, you can easily think of examples for California. You've had a sequence of extreme droughts that's fairly unprecedented. And then you have things like wildfire and COVID compounding those. So these things really do happen and if you're just looking at one risk at a time, you're not necessarily thinking about how things might compound. And the other really interesting part of this story is that the insurance industry isn't really incorporating long-term risk is what came out of it. Because they can just adjust your rates every year. So what that means is that the homeowners are really the ones bearing the brunt of the long-term risk not being well captured in their current policies. So what happens is suddenly your rates go way up or you lose the ability to get insurance. So that's kind of the reason that you might want to anticipate these events. So it's not that you're going to prevent them or manage your way out of them, but you can soften the impact of when they do occur. And so, and really planning for this kind of risk is important in so many ways. It has many ramifications. This financial group emphasized not planning for risk effectively could affect things like municipal bond rates. So that's the rate that governments borrow money at. And having good credit is really important because the lower your borrowing costs, the more good you can do with your public dollars. The more infrastructure projects, the more restoration. So that's, I think, helps what we're trying to do with this project. So now Tanya, go ahead.
I just wanted to first thank you, Lisa, for adding that story that gives some context to what we mean by deep uncertainty. I think in the draft document that we have right now, and this is a point Obey made, I think that we haven't really crystallized our definition of what we mean by deep uncertainty in that draft. So I just wanted to add a couple things to what you already said to maybe reinforce why this notion of deep uncertainty is important, because we're not only looking at just uncertainty around, some unknown kind of probability distributions of an event, like we think of with some parametric uncertainty, but the underlying kind of factors that drive that uncertainty are changing and complex. So there's structural uncertainty, which I think you kind of pointed out. We can have changing policies that can be integrated into then, the uncertainty that emerges in a lot of different ways. And so you can have a lot of future trajectories. So there might be multiple pathways that you could envision. And it's very difficult to then assess kind of what the right objective function is for determining the best path forward or whose interests are going to be prioritized, because we're not sure which pathway we're going to be on. And so I kind of wanted to just re-emphasize that the notion of deep uncertainty is different than the typical uncertainty that we've been kind of talking about with a lot of our other assessments and ISB reports, if that helps.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, I think we do need to keep defining this and saying more clearly what we mean. Go ahead, Virginia.
I just wanted to reference, as Lisa knows, one of my favorite papers is by Bob Payne and colleagues that looked at compounded disturbances. And what they showed from many examples was you have a trajectory and you have a disturbance, a fire, a wind throw, a hurricane, whatever. And this ecosystem, by several measures, number of species, biomass, underground productivity, will drop down, but then over time it'll come back up to that equilibrium generally. But if you have one disturbance and it drops down, and then another disturbance, it comes back to a new equilibrium. And Bob and his colleagues showed this with several different ecological examples. And to me, that's a big uncertainty with more than one disturbance. So you have changes in temperatures and a fire, two of many things. You can go to a new place that the ecosystem may not have experienced previously.
Yeah, there are a lot of concepts out there that we can build on. So that's helpful, Virginia. Thanks. Obey.
Yeah, a couple of comments. I think what you and Tanya said, it's very accurate. I feel like we need to, this is going to be a little bit harder. I think to the stakeholders and other decision makers, we will need to make an effort to explain what we mean by deep uncertainty in a way that with examples and Delta maybe that we can illustrate what we mean by this concept here, assuming that's what we are going to address. And I think, if you go by some of the classical definitions, which I tried to indicate in the draft paper, that the deep uncertainty is when people cannot agree on the models that they use, and also they cannot even agree on probabilities of certain events happening. I think, but I think, Lisa, you also mentioned that there is a spectrum from uncertainty to deep uncertainty. But I feel like we need to kind of maybe clearly articulate what we mean by deep uncertainty. So to the folks who in dealing with Bay Delta, that they can understand exactly. I think the climate change is a classic example. There are a lot of future scenarios or pathways, and it all depends on what the society does. And also this whole issue of what happens to rare extremes or what happens to atmospheric rivers, and this whole fires, that will change the whole hydrologic response. So all this compounding uncertainty, does that make it a situation of deep uncertainty? I think, anyway, I just wanted us to be a bit more clear. I think the draft is good to explain that now, but I just wanted to put it out there.
Yeah, thanks, Obey. I mean, it may be just because I do think the reason I called it a spectrum is because sometimes, just like that insurance example, they do have a probability distribution, but they're just kind of ignoring the tails. Like they don't really manage for the tails. And so that to me is the overlap in terms of, well, let's really look at the more extreme conditions isn't exactly the same thing as deep uncertainty as classically defined, but still could be useful. So I think hopefully we can find the right scope with our stakeholders, in ways that will be useful to them more than just being very strict about a given definition, so is my thinking. We can keep discussing. Let's hear from some other folks. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I would recommend that for California, you use earthquakes as the example, because we actually have a very good example of the challenge of deep uncertainty in terms of the Northridge earthquake. In '94, our housing market basically collapsed because you couldn't get earthquake insurance, or you couldn't get a mortgage because the earthquake insurance market had collapsed. And if you move on to the Delta, one of the real challenges there is the uncertainty in the seismic risk. It's very difficult to quantify. So anyway, I think that example might work a little or resonate a little better with the audience out here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as you brought up, it has a lot of implications for levee stability. And so that directly relates to water supply and ecological concerns. So thanks, Tom. Yeah, that's great. Steve.
Yeah, I think this is a fun topic. It should generate a lot of interest, certainly amongst the board members and hopefully a lot of others. Right now, I think it's still very broad, as maybe it should be in the very beginning, because to me, when I think about this, there's just thinking about what's already just been talked about. There's the uncertainty of sort of maybe low probability, high impact events. There's also probabilities associated with just the unknowns. We don't understand or know anything about certain relationships, so there's uncertainty that's driven by that. It may not be the drivers, it may just be the response of the ecosystem. And then there's uncertainty, as you mentioned in the report, that cuts across water supply, salinity management, ecosystem. So it's a very, very broad thing. And I'm wondering how we narrow it down to get management and stakeholder interest in it. I don't have a lot of ways, but one thing to think about it is think about what current management is using for performance measures, and target in on those performance measures and say, okay, what kind of uncertainty are associated around that? What could really be have major impact, for example, and take those expected performance measures in a completely different direction, and maybe that can broaden the thinking around those performance measures. So it's not simply just a small change here going to change our performance measure, but something could happen that throws that performance measure totally out of whack. But some way to focus this in, which I think will happen as we move through the process. The question I have is, do you have a time frame for when some of this stuff will be implemented?
Yeah, so we haven't put together the full prospectus yet. We've actually had a little trouble scheduling, how we're going to sequence this. But we do think we'll start, but the plan is to start with some seminars to and through that process start engaging people on what kinds of questions they could see this being applied to. And we're really thinking that we could start that in March as our goal. And I don't think we've really set the exact timeline. So maybe we'd have seminars for 6 months or something. And then, but also simultaneously be starting this survey that I think covers some of your concerns. But I think your point about performance metrics is a good one. We wanted to really better understand how agencies are already characterizing uncertainty and whether deep uncertainty is even on their radar once we are sure we want to define it a certain way. So yeah, I think that's yet to be determined. But we do understand we don't want this to keep being like, oh, and now our plan is this, and now our plan is slightly changed. We want to move forward soon. Bob.
Yeah, I think this is a very exciting topic. I can see how everyone in the group would become intellectually engaged in this, and I can see in general as a topic, I can see a lot of other scientists and agencies and so on wanting to embrace it. The problem I guess I'm having, and perhaps you can speak to this, maybe you can't right now, but I am having a hard time getting my arms around it in the sense I don't know how the information will be used, how it will, in the end, how will it be applied so it becomes useful to agencies and the public. And I was wondering if you've given much thought to that, because I can certainly see the excitement in exploring this topic, but unless it's used in some tangible way, I don't quite understand how it's going to get the traction that it's needed down the road. So if somebody could speak to that, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll say something, and I think I should let Laurel add to this because I know she's been thinking about it too. And we'll start there, and then we'll get to Inga, and Obey probably has a comment too. So there are some things that have already been suggested to us, like something came up the other day in terms of dam rules. So something near and dear to your heart, Bob, this idea of environmental flows or how we manage reservoirs. It's currently very difficult to change the rules of how reservoirs are managed. And so if we can draw attention to the fact that things are changing, it might make it easier to change those dam rules, like there are release requirements and things like that. And so I see a lot of potential practical uses, but I do think we need to talk to our agencies and other stakeholders to really learn. Laurel, what would you add to this?
So a couple of things. Can you hear me? Okay. A couple of things. So one of the things that we're really emphasizing in the 2022 to 2026 science action agenda is doing trade-off assessment, trying to understand how future management scenarios in combination with future climate scenarios will play out for social systems, ecological systems, water supply systems, et cetera. I think there is not sufficient guidance circulating in the community right now on how to robustly design the scenarios that are being evaluated. And, you know, reality is we have computational limits. A lot of these models are hugely computationally expensive. And so we need to be strategic about how we define scenarios that we invest time in looking at. So that's one practical outcome. The other thing that we've been talking about internally is that in other sectors that the discipline of future science deals with, future scientists have helped managers and people in key roles in companies prepare for deep uncertainty by actually doing simulations with them. So these are almost like role-playing games in which a hypothetical situation develops and people act as they would in their job functions for a set period of time in order to identify what the sticking points are. And maybe it's contracting. I think maybe that's something Diane McKnight mentioned a little bit earlier. Maybe contracting is the bottleneck to really being able to respond, quickly to a rapid development. But I think this could be another item of interest that could come out of this seminar series and this exploration of the tools that are used across a range of disciplines to deal with a highly uncertain future. And so I guess I'm responding both to Bob and to Steve, because I think the way to constrain the scope of this exercise is really to keep the focus on tools and looking outside our immediate disciplines to evaluate the tools that are used to deal with many different types of uncertainty that are poorly quantifiable and hard to anticipate.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And so it's just a matter of when there is a long-term planning thing that can be informed, that's one type of activity, or just more generally, increasing the response rate to major events and maybe not changing that much about day-to-day management, but just being more ready for the extreme events. Okay, Inga, please join.
Yeah, it's all been said actually, but when Steve mentioned performance measures, that really brought it down to the practical part for me, because this is a key thing for me to evaluate risk in the environment, no matter from what. What performance measures are we using and are they really appropriate? So I think that would really be a very good link to practice, to practical work on the ground. So that's all.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a really good point. Yeah, Obey.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think Bob raised an important point, and I would like to think that we would come up with the strategy how to deal with this deep uncertainty in the context of the Delta planning, right? So I think, to that event, I think I also agree with Laura that we need to think about tools. And I think some of you may know this, and I put that in as a reference in this document. There is an entity called Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. There's a book that is freely available. Anybody can download that. It's and I attended a workshop in Oxford, England, one time on that. So there have been several tools that I hope we can deal with it if you're going to suggest tools. For example, this concept of decision scaling, a bottom-up approach is one that I like. sort of like stress testing. And the other one is the dynamic adaptive policy pathway strategy that the Dutch are using. And the other one is robust decision-making strategies that the RAND Corporation has pioneered, this concept called scenario discovery. I think there are some tools to deal with this particular issue of deep uncertainty, and I'm hoping we could investigate or at least make some recommendations on the tools that could be used, going forward, in addition to trying to define and deal with the, I think the seminars will help us a lot if we invite the right people.
Yeah, good points. And I will point out that that book you mentioned is cited in that handout. So if folks are interested to look up that book, it's the Marchot et al.
Right.
Reference. Virginia, please.
Oh. Okay, I'm on. So the paper I mentioned by Payne about compounded disturbance was part of a workshop that NCs had on large and frequent disturbances. And I was part of a paper on managing ecosystems under these disturbances. And what we showed with numerous examples that often it was much more cost effective to think about these changes before they occurred and to manage beforehand than to think about managing in the aftermath. And there are tools for this. And since then, when I go to management activities, it's so often that we look at things in the aftermath, and it's so much harder and it's more costly to do that. So to me, that's the reason for doing this in spite of the uncertainties.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. I think that's a really good point. There's so many applications to infrastructure design or even program design. I've had personal experience with this where people want to do the project that has the highest benefit cost ratio under the best guess future. And if you start doing the stress testing that Obey mentioned, which is under what conditions does this break? So we don't know how often we're going to get this certain wave. This had to do with a port. We don't know how often we're going to get a certain wave activity or hurricane, or it's hard to predict. But it wouldn't take something that's 2% above average is enough to make this not perform well, or 2% above the best guess rather. So you start to just get this qualitative sense of, it doesn't take that much to break this approach. How might we want to do it differently? And so that's kind of the beauty of this, the scenario analysis. Any other comments? Okay, well, I just want to let folks know, and anyone who might be listening, that we're open to suggestions of areas where they see applicability, or if you have a project in deep uncertainty you'd like us to consider, we're very open to hearing from stakeholders. So any other last words from the planning team? Nothing yet. We will be getting back to you with more details. So, okay. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and wrap up this agenda item then, and let's go ahead and get to our next agenda item. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, so I think I will hold the break and just go ahead and let's start the EIR review discussion. Let me just get back to my agenda to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Okay, so we're talking about agenda item 5. We'll move the break down a little bit to when we need a break from our discussion. And this is our last agenda item before lunch too. So what we're going to do now is have a good conversation about what we should do with this, this draft report. So first, let me give a little background. In April 2020, the Delta ISB submitted a public comment to DWR, the Department of Water Resources, on the notice of preparation on the Delta Conveyance Project, indicating our plans to review the environmental impact report, what we refer to as the EIR, and highlighting areas from previous reviews of things we hope they've considered in this EIR. DWR provided updates to the Delta ISB in August 2020, January 22, June 22, and July 22. They were responsive to our questions and requests for more information. And then the EIR was released on 7/27 And now final comments are due December 16th, just not very far from today. So since that release of the EIR, the Delta ISB has been drafting individual comments, and a public draft was released for the November meeting. And then based on the discussion at the last meeting, Steve and I have revised the draft, and that new draft is part of your package. And one thing I want to call attention to before we even start the conversation is 2 sets of the document were made available to the public for this meeting. And so one is the old one and one is the new one. So if you've looked at the report, please make sure you're looking at the December 1st version, which is the new one, because it's easy to get confused. Okay. And then where we're headed today is that we'd like to take action. We'd like to, by lunch, have a content approval vote, and then just discuss whatever our next steps are needed for before we submit it to DWR. So again, before we start, let me just give a little intro here in terms of what I see. First of all, I'm just really impressed by the amount of work, the quality of the work that people have put into this. There are some novel scientific analyses of the model output data. There are a broad range of considerations that have been included in this report. And the report is 2 parts. So also just want to make sure that everyone who might be looking at the report understands the organization. There's the main report, which is a summary of our major concerns. And then there's what we call the appendix, which has more detailed comments, including whole new topics of concern, but things that were not put in the main report because primarily, I think, because we didn't think it would change the significance of an impact, but some of it is uncertain, that there are, I would say most of our comments are about omissions in the analysis. So there's no real way for us to know how important any given comment is. And so for that, because we don't know until we analyze it. So for that reason, we hope, and we will emphasize this to DWR when we send it in, that just because it's in the more detailed appendix doesn't mean it's necessarily less important. But the purpose of this conversation is to make sure we have really highlighted what we feel confident are our major concerns. And to date, our main concern is that the science is uneven and that there are these omissions, and that perhaps the EIR could be improved in terms of really characterizing the potential impacts versus benefits. I think that's an overarching statement of our concerns. But this unevenness that we all see, so some people thought some parts were strong, some people thought that some parts were quite weak. And because we read different areas according to our expertise, that means that we may have a different overall sense of the report amongst ourselves. So this makes it difficult to make very general comments, and it's why a lot of specific comments are in the appendix. So anyway, as we open up this conversation, I really think we should be addressing 2 main questions. You can feel free to disagree, but to me, the strongest questions are, did we fail to elevate anything from the appendix to the main report that we feel is a strong concern, something that could really change how the project alternatives are perceived? And then, is there anything in here you just can't sign on to, that you disagree with strongly? And I'm really going to count on you folks to elevate your concerns. Hopefully you have some thoughts on these 2 questions already, but in the interest of making sure that we cover some topics before some members have to drop off, I would like to prioritize the water supply and climate change discussions. And then I think our next area that needs discussion is aquatic habitat. And then I think maybe we should talk about the social issues and whether we've highlighted enough of them in the main report. So that's what I see as potentially 4 main areas of interest. Maybe we should just do a quick test of the room here and see if anyone wants to say, oh, I think this section really needs a lot of discussion or something like that. Does anyone have any concerns like that? Steve?
I was just going to add to the instructions just a little bit. To emphasize that what we're going to be voting on is the content of both the main report and the appendix, and not style or editing and things like that. And the idea would be, at the end of the day, we would vote on accepting the content as is or with modifications that we will document. And then that would go back to Lisa and I to do the final draft and editing. I know we're still receiving editing comments as early as today, so there would be some edits that would be could still be incorporated, but without changing the content. So that's the goal today, is to think about the content of what is there, meaningful content.
Thank you, Steve. You're so much better at explaining process than I am. Thank you. Anna.
Just for clarification, as a new person on the board, there's things that are clearly content and there's things that are clearly editing, but then there's things that are, emphasizing a certain point. Or so can you clarify for us where you consider to be the dividing line between what is content and what is editing for things that just for framing our discussion?
I'll try. Go ahead, Steve.
For me, it's a matter of, does it change the meaning? Is there a change in the meaning of the statement? And and that's simple. It's content. If someone said this, do you accept it or don't accept it? In terms of its meaning. If you disagree with the meaning of that sentence or disagree with it, then I think then that becomes content. It's a gray zone, obviously, but someone says this is very good versus very, very good versus very, very, very good. I don't know if that's necessarily a change in meaning, or content. It might be a slight change, a little bit of emphasis, but if someone said this is wrong and someone said this is right, obviously that's a change in meaning or content.
I think it'll probably become clear as we go through. I'm thinking of things that have to do with sort of clarifications or sort of the relative emphasis that certain points get in the report, and those to me are in that gray zone. But let's just not talk about it in the abstract. We can talk about it when we get there.
I think that sounds helpful. I would just add to Steve's definition that if we want to add new major points to the main document, I would also consider that a content issue. So, Tom.
Anna's question and Steve's sort of explanation raised a point that occurred to me when I was reading particularly the appendix, and that is there's a lot of unevenness from the comments on the chapters. And the one that really stood out to me was the comments on soils. It really doesn't say a lot. So, I mean, it could be deleted without affecting content. So it would be an editorial suggestion by the standards of the past suggestion. But I think some of us need to go through there and ask, does this commentary on each chapter have enough significance that it's warranted to be in there? It's in there right now, I think, primarily because somebody read it and we were obligated to make some comments. They're, like I said, in some cases, not substantive enough to be of much help.
Yeah, I guess I agree with what you're saying, Tom, and I'm always for parsimony in reports, but I guess the reason we left it in was because we wanted to say, hey, we read this and we didn't really find any major concerns, because that in and of itself is a bit of a finding.
Yeah. I wouldn't worry about that, because if it doesn't add anything to the discussion, what's the point?
Yeah, I think, Tom, you're right. And I think there's a lot of that, because we all have different writing styles and different groups. We're looking at this. And as we said, some chapters were uneven. So therefore, the degree of commentary is. I think in many respects, I would argue that's really an editing thing. If there's a sentence that if it's in there or not in there doesn't change the content, then it's not a content discussion, because some people can say leave it in, some take it out. That's a debate, but it doesn't change the content in terms of meaningful content.
Yeah,
makes sense, because I think soils is one, but there's clearly some other areas where it could go both ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unevenness in the individual discussions, and I'm fine with that. But it was when it got to the point where it really didn't say very much. Why bother?
Obe.
Yeah, I think I'm going to maybe ask this issue, or ask about this issue, that if we covered this adequately or not. Well, a couple of issues. One is, I think this whole issue of what is required in CEQA versus what we would naturally do in an assessment of a project like this. I think we covered that even in the main report. I was curious if we covered that adequately. The other bigger issue to me is we covered the issue of climate change variability and how the modeling was done using a sort of the median central tendency scenario. I think we covered that adequately. But what I'm not sure is whether we covered this whole issue of, under future warming conditions with the forest fires and with whether the entire tributary watershed responses might change in the future, and whether we covered that adequately in the report, that is something that needs to be incorporated along with the changes in the climate change drivers that, in terms of water availability. I was just curious. I know there was some places we mentioned, but I'm not sure I'm wondering if we covered that adequately.
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly good question. I can say that there is a section where we talk about types of drivers. So that unfortunately, a lot got packed into this one topic area, which was types of drivers, accumulation in time, and just cumulative effects at the landscape scale. That all got kind of lumped in terms of, well, we don't see enough of this. And so perhaps adding an example would potentially be helpful there, because that issue has come up very specifically of changing hydrologic responses. Tanya.
Yeah, I just read through our main summary report, not the appendix, yesterday, and I do feel like we touch on that in section 4.6 on the impacts and interactions across systems and the cumulative effects, but there maybe, Obe, if you could give that section a close read and see if there's a stronger way to make that point. I feel like it's in there, but I think the problem is we talk about those kind of interactive effects maybe separately from the climate effects, and maybe that.
Yeah, I will.
Confusing.
Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Obe. This kind of relates to what I'm going to say is a content change a little bit. And it has to do with in the main report, item number 4, in terms of major concerns. I think there's in the original first discussion of that on page 4, it says uncertainty due to climate change is inadequately evaluated. And this is on page 4. Then, yeah, it's just go down to, okay. Uncertainty due to climate change is inadequately evaluated. And I think that's great. Now, if you go to page 14, and reread it there, it says uncertainty of future weather conditions due to climate change is inadequately evaluated. I think that's a significant change in the meaning, because it's uncertainty of climate change versus uncertainty of future weather conditions due to climate change. And if you read what we say in there, we talk a little bit about weather in the first paragraph, and then we talk about climate change in the next few paragraphs. And sort of what Obe said about climate change changing the whole watershed is one example of a massive climate change impact that is not related to weather. And I even think in terms of the increasing frequency of storms, a storm is weather, but increased frequency of storms is climate, to me anyway. And so I'm just going to argue that this 4.4 on page 14 is changed back to the original intent, which was the uncertainty due to climate change is inadequately evaluated. I think this sentence here emphasizes weather rather than climate change. Anyway, that's.
So before we go to Virginia, thanks, Steve. Does anyone want to comment on that comment before we move to Virginia? Oh, Virginia wants to comment on that comment. Go ahead, Virginia.
I wasn't going to do this, but so I agree with you, Steve, and I agree with the explanation, that we've talked about previously of why it was weather. So maybe we should say uncertainty of future weather conditions and disturbance regimes, because we're really talking about those local or regional changes rather than climate change for the whole US. I think this was kind of the difference when weather was used rather than climate change.
Well, to me, that I don't know if that addresses it, because maybe you could say uncertainty of regional climate change or something like that, because I think that there are things like sea level rise that don't necessarily relate to weather, and I think we do discuss both, and when you go through the next 3 or 4 paragraphs on this topic. But I think when we're talking about 2040, 2070, we're not talking about weather, we're talking about climate level things, maybe regional climate change if you want to stick that in. But the way it's worded here seems to me uncertainty of future weather conditions, and it's much broader than that.
Okay, Virginia, I think you had another point, but let's hear from Obe and Anna, who both work in this area, so we can round out this discussion. Go ahead, Obe.
Yeah, I think I'm with Steve on this. I think he defined clearly what, weather versus climate change. I think what we are addressing here is that regional climate change. So the title of this section 4.4, we may now want to mention weather conditions here. If it, I think what we are talking about the future, regional climate change and the uncertainties associated with that. So I don't know if there's a whole lot of discussion on weather in this section or not, but I think we are talking about regional climate change uncertainty here.
Okay, Anna.
So I also agree with what Obe just said, maybe to frame it slightly differently. For many years, we've sort of in climate science, we sort of made the distinction between weather being the short-term stuff and climate being the long-term stuff. And of course, the reality is that they both interact through extreme events and so on. But I agree that framing the potential impacts of climate exclusively through the lens of weather appears to de-emphasize things like long-term change, long-term trends, and so on. And so I think there's a risk to framing it this way, and I see much less of a risk in reframing it in a way that isn't explicitly tied to weather, at least at the highest level.
Okay, sounds like we have good consensus here that we will change this language. I will say that I think weather crept in because the majority of the text here is about how water flow was represented. So the idea being that you've got an existing historical range or sequence of storms, precipitation, and to generate climate, we've just done the delta approach of just, okay, climate's going to increase precipitation, whatever it is, X%, and we've added that to this sequence. So in a sense, it kind of became weather again. So that was why that word crept in. But I think we do really want to make the point that we're talking about climate, even though our main example is about how weather is modeled.
And I think, you can have it both ways by talking about variability, by talking about extremes, by talking about the types of weather that we would expect under climate change. But I think the climate needs to be the central component so that it's not artificially narrowed. And I don't think there's any harm in the example still being based on what you just described.
Okay, this is helpful. Yeah, Obey, you have and we're gonna get back to you, Virginia.
One final point on this. I think, I mean, we need, I hope we agree that weather is a very short-term phenomenon, but here we are talking about a longer-term seasonal to annual to probably even decadal scale in terms of talking about 2040, 2070 trajectories of how the inflows of precipitation might change. So in keeping with that, and unless there's a lot on weather in this section, maybe we should take that weather term, word weather out of there, so we don't give a different connotation to what we are talking about here. I don't know. That's kind of, maybe we should have a
Yeah,
separate.
no, I think people agree. Let's do it. I don't think we need to keep belaboring this. I think, yeah, so we'll just go ahead and do that. Steve, do you need to make a comment here, or can I go to Virginia? You're muted. You're muted.
I thought there was going to be editing, but maybe not. I think it's a very simple solution. Just put regional climate uncertainty and go back to the way it was originally stated, and that solves it. So
sounds good. Okay, let's move on. Virginia, you had another point you wanted to raise.
Okay, well, actually, now I have 2 points. That my first point relates to what we just discussed and what I'm about to discuss. And that is, as was brought up, when we talk about these major concerns, we can't present all the examples in this. And many of the examples are in the appendix relative to the chapter. So I think on page 4, where we introduce the appendix, now it says, I lost it. But anyway, we say that, more targeted reviews and questions are described in the appendix. And I'd like to say more targeted examples and reviews and questions, or examples of the key points below, are in the appendix. Because when we came up with these key points, we had lots of different examples, but we didn't want to make this summary too long. So that's one point. And the second point actually goes back to the example that Obey raised about watershed impacts related to drought. And then Tanya said that's really under 4.6, which I agree with. And the examples now presented under 4.6 that we're not looking at that the draft did not look at the whole system as well as it could. The examples we have are now largely aquatic. And so if Obey would write a 1 or 2 sentence of the example he presented and put it there, I think that would be helpful in this general summary.
Yeah, those are great specific suggestions. Thank you. I think that all makes sense to me. But rather than replace the questions and reviews, I would like to add examples up above, if that works.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. But and in 4.6, we'll add something about changing watershed hydrologic processes. Hopefully, Obey will. Okay, Steve, is that hand up for a new comment, or is that left over?
yeah, it's a follow-up comment to Virginia's comment about the appendix, and actually we talk about what's in the appendix in 3 different places. Page 4, page 6, and in the introduction to the appendix, and we all say it a little bit differently what the purpose of the appendix is. So I would argue we need to be a little bit more consistent. One of the things I'd just like to bring up as a suggestion is that I sense that there's a lot of very important material in the appendix that we don't necessarily want to relegate to an appendix of details. And I know in past we've had a main report and an appendix, but one, I think we should write the language carefully that we don't dissuade people from looking at the appendix. And secondly, maybe we ought to put it part 1 and part 2, and just change the whole idea of having an appendix. That's just a suggestion. I could go either way, but I'm thinking that may be something that would help beef up the importance of the appendix, so it's not just left aside.
Tanya.
I like that idea, Steve. I think there are so many details in the appendix, and I mean, the main part of our review right now is more of the integrated kind of cross-cutting issues. So we have the cross-cutting review, and then we have chapter by chapter specific review comments, and we could just call it that. Yeah.
That seems like an elegant solution. Other comments on that? I think we just want to be clear to folks, you know, what they're getting into when they read different documents. But yeah, I think that's a nice, I think Tanya captured it well. Cross-cutting versus chapter by chapter. Yeah. I wonder if we need to, this may be in the editorial realm, but I have a little bit of a concern that it's the fact that we didn't include a lot of, we have some substantive comments about the social science chapters, but very little of that made it into the cross-cutting issues. And so I hope the folks don't think that we in any way devalued those aspects. It really, there's no value judgment in terms of what went in here. It was more like, did we have a bunch of comments on the same thing, for want of a better term? So I'd like to make that clear, certainly in the transmittal letter, and possibly beef that up in the introduction. But we didn't put in things that we didn't think would have major ramifications for the level of significance. You know, a lot of times it was recognized in the EIR itself that there was substantial and unavoidable impacts, and our little comments suggested that maybe in terms of thinking about mitigation, they might think of it differently, for example, rather than having any fundamental problem with how they came up with the fact that they assigned significant impacts. So that's, I think, why a lot of those are in the appendix. Anna.
I have a comment about 4.3, so that's on a separate point, so I can just hold on to it till this topic is finished.
Okay, well, I mean, if anyone, I guess now would be the time to disagree about adding some wording about that if it's not already in there. And if I don't hear anything, I'll assume you agree. Looks like no major objections to that. Go ahead, Anna. Go ahead, take us to the next topic.
So both in rereading the current draft and also thinking back to the discussion we had at our last in-person meeting, you know, there's a lot of issues around this, you know, less than significant. And to me, there are three major themes that fall under 4.3. And in reading the way this section is now written, it strikes me that all three themes are there, but they're all interwoven in each of the paragraphs. And I think we may benefit from explicitly listing them out and calling them out separately. And the three themes are, one is around the uncertainty of the effectiveness of the mitigation approaches, and also the uncertainty associated with the impacts themselves. Second is this comment about potentially the EIR being overly optimistic about the effectiveness of mitigation approaches. And third is this topic of, because often the impact is assessed only after the mitigation is taken into account. I remember many of us commenting on the fact that it would be helpful to understand what the impacts would be on their own, separately from what the impacts are likely to remain after the mitigation approaches. And so again, the three pieces being the uncertainty, the potential for the assumptions about mitigation being overly optimistic, and the third being what is the impact before mitigation rather than just the impact after mitigation. And so I see that they're all there, but if I wasn't looking for them, I'm not sure if all three would become very apparent to me in reading these paragraphs. And so again, this is partially why I was asking about the what's editorial versus what's substantive. I think it's all there, but I think that more clearly calling out the three things that fall under this topic somewhat separately might be beneficial in transmitting our main message.
Understood. Tanya, do you have a comment on this topic?
Yeah, I like Anna's suggestions there, and just I think if we make those, well, regardless of whether we make those changes, I think the heading for section 4.3 doesn't fully convey those 3 points either. It kind of focuses on one of them, and maybe we can, again, that's editing, but just want to make sure that our point, the main ideas that Anna was conveying there are clear to the reader.
I just to chime in, I'm sorry, my head is not up, but I agree with Tanya. I originally was worried that the sort of before versus after mitigation point was not there at all. But then in reading, I noted that it is there, but I agree with Tanya that it's not apparent from the heading of that section.
Great. Well, we will accept all recommendations along those lines. Yeah, I perhaps do see them all as pretty connected. Maybe it's just the way different brains work. So I'm happy if it's not communicating well, I'd love for suggestions to be made. Yeah.
They're definitely connected, and I don't think we should claim otherwise. I was more reading it, if I were reading it as someone who would receive this report, whether all three aspects of this would float up, and I worried that perhaps someone might take away just one or two, and then we might find at whatever happens next, that at the next phase we would find that the points had not been addressed, but simply because they had not been sort of elucidated from the way we wrote about them.
Right, because it's really three different actions. No, I completely understand what you're saying, and yeah, I think it would be very clarifying. Inga.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading less than significant, and I had, I'm not sure at the moment, I cannot open my document on that, but where else we could address that, of how these less than significant impacts were derived, and how it was concluded that the impact was less than significant. I found it most disturbing with regard to the chemical contaminant data, which for some is very extensive and for many is far less than adequate to draw any conclusions. So I would really like to see a sentence on that somewhere, but I couldn't, when I reviewed the document, I couldn't really find an obvious spot to put that in, but maybe we could work on that too. Just the conclusion less than significant is sometimes really based on assumptions rather than data. So.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. We definitely have a lot of comments like that throughout the appendix, or part 2, as we're now calling it. And I think the problem was we had trouble making a generic statement because sometimes they did it really well and sometimes they didn't do it well. So that was one of those things where a lot of people had this concern, but somehow it didn't get stated as strongly in the cross-cutting issues because it was inconsistent in the EIR. So I think you're right that we need to say it's not just well, I think it is primarily in the ecological outcomes. So we need to say that it's more than just habitat restoration. So you're saying it's also the chemical constituents, and I guess if others have cases where they've really looked, and sometimes it was just buried. So this is another thing where it wouldn't be very obvious from reading the main report, but if you made it all the way to the bottom or you went to the appendix, you would eventually find where they had defined stuff really well. So that's also, I think, why that got a little de-emphasized, is it was in there somewhere, it was just really buried. But I think what you're saying is that sometimes it just wasn't even in there.
It wasn't adequate. And I might add that often the argument was made, there are no new sources of these contaminants in the Delta. So therefore, there is a less than significant impact of the alternatives, right? but I mean, the main issue is about changes in the flows and how concentrations might change in certain areas of the delta. So that wasn't even addressed at all. So, but again, I'm not really sure where exactly this would fit in. It made it into the, these comments made it, of course, into the appendix of the review, but they're not in the main document.
Well, let's think about that. Could you maybe write a couple sentences? I think contaminants in general haven't been given a lot of attention, just because of you all came later. Some of these comments arose after we had already written the cross-cutting issues. So if you can write a little paragraph, I think I'm sure we could find somewhere to fit it in, because this was a very common comment in some initial drafts, and so I think your point is well taken that this should be elevated.
Okay, I will work on that and look for spots to insert. Yeah.
Steve.
Yeah, to follow up on that, we should probably identify where exactly is it going to go. Is it going to go in as topic number 9, or is it going to go in one of these other topics? Because if we raise something that we haven't seen to item number 9, that's a significant change.
What about, so I think it could possibly go under 4.3, particularly if we separate out the fact that, so we could have a paragraph that's about, you haven't always given us what the impact is prior to mitigation, and then sometimes the criteria are unclear. That could be one way to work it in. Do others see other places where it could fit?
Could you summarize what the, in one sentence, what the content of that new writing would be?
Are you talking to me right now, Steve?
Yes.
Not right now, but I've been trying and I've been thinking about it, but I need to give it some more thought to make it really concise.
But in terms of a general.
Yeah, we need a content idea so that we can, if we're
Okay.
going to vote on it.
Well, that the data that was provided does not really support any kind of conclusion, other than there is a lack of data to draw conclusions. That would summarize my main concern.
Relative to contaminants?
Yes.
Did you also suggest that it was only some contaminants, that sometimes it was done well, or is that flow issue persistent across all the contaminants?
Well, it's very inconsistent in terms of the availability of data. For example, mercury and selenium, there's a lot known about those because they've been studied very intensely. And if you look at the appendix of the EIR, there's an enormous amount of data and also content. But to go to the other extreme, for example, for endocrine disrupting compounds, there's only the mention of, I think it wasn't studied at all in the Delta, I'm not entirely sure, but there's only mention of a 2009 paper where one data point was used and the rest is speculative, in terms of coming to the less than significant impact conclusion. So there's a wide range of data availability across certain contaminants and groups of contaminants.
Perhaps.
This is starting to remind me of some comments that Virginia's been making about how they haven't been clear about different levels of confidence in findings. And we did put that under 4.7. I see that we don't have anything about confidence in the top heading there. Maybe that's a change we could make. But anyway, I think possibly Steve and Tanya want to give you some help here. And so let's let them talk. But I will say that I see that's another place then, because they haven't expressed this difference in confidence among these findings. So
Maybe that would be
That's
the main.
exactly, yeah, what I was gonna say, Lisa, is
Mhm.
4.7 seems like it could fit there. I think thematically, it makes sense from my mind. I think we just have to tweak the heading a little bit.
I would suggest maybe another spot, if you could move up one paragraph, Edmund, to the last paragraph in 4.6, right there. That talks a lot about the water quality and public health, and also the impact of changes on the biota that's reflected on that. I'm wondering if the contaminant issue could be another example that would fall under that paragraph.
I don't know if it fits as well thematically, though, with the kind of main point that we're trying to make, the cross-cutting point. But
which comes in the next paragraph, right? The confidence issue. Yeah.
yeah, but maybe.
I could see actually mentioning this twice. I think the Inga's example of only using one data point in one case versus a wealth of data in others is just a really clear example of why that confidence is important to express. And so if nothing else, I still would like it as an example there, but maybe also it's related to just how are you defining significance. So yeah, I see potentially it going those two places. Also, I just want to acknowledge that I see Diane who's joined us. Diane, do you want to just say your name and whether you have any new conflicts?
Hi, so I'm Diane McKnight, and I don't have any new conflicts, and I've been dealing with this cold for some time. I apologize, and but I am glad to be here for this discussion.
Thank you, Diane. We won't put you on the spot, but if feel free to jump in if you have other things you want to add. Okay, so we do have a proposal, which hopefully Edmund's captured, which is we'll figure out exactly the best place to put it, but we want to say something about clearly, well, let's see. I think I want to make sure that we're capturing something that I think was a little more about the science than the confidence, and that was not paying attention to concentrations changes that could result from changes in flow. Is that your point, Inga, as well?
That's one point, yes. Mm-hmm.
So that seems like a pretty important point as well. So maybe we can add that somewhere where we talk about water quality effects being examined, possibly where Steve just suggested. And then we also have this comment about, and we want to be clear how significance was determined and whether there's good, whether there's largely varying degrees of confidence. Does that capture it?
The confidence, yeah, confidence would be good. I would just like to see a clear statement on if or if not, if a conclusion can be drawn or if it cannot be drawn based on the data. So that would summarize that, I think.
I wonder if they have the option to not conclude. I think could be putting them
that I don't know
into a difficult place, but but we can certainly, we can certainly say that. Yeah. Okay, that's good. That's really the kind of content issues I'm hoping to hear about. One thing we could do right now, we could take our break that we never took, and people could just have some quiet time to think about other issues that they might want to elevate, as Inga has described. That would be my suggestion, Steve.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up something for people to think about during coffee. One of the, I think it's really important that that every sentence we write is scientifically sound and justifiable. And that means that we need to be extremely objective, and we need to be include appropriate qualifiers, like you would in any paper. My data indicate this, it doesn't explicitly prove anything. And I think I did go through the summary in the at one stage and did all of that sentence by sentence. But somewhere along the line, some of those I guess qualifiers got eliminated, and I want to suggest we put them back in. And I'm going to just give you two examples and think about it as in the way of if you take a sentence completely out of context, is it a valid sentence? And if we go to page 2, I'm just going to give you two examples, and then you can tell me to go away. So Edmund, can you get to page 2? Edmund, are you there? Okay, there we go. This paragraph that starts with "in general," that's good right there. It's if you read that last sentence in the paragraph that's showing, it says collectively these omissions lead to an inadequate representation and discussion of potential project impacts and benefits. To me, that's sort of subjective. It leads to an inadequate representation and discussion. In other words, it says, and it talks about all emissions, and a qualifier in there might be to rather than say inadequate, might be incomplete or something like that. But inadequate seems like a word I'm not sure I would use. And go to another one just to show you what. So that sentence out of context. Next page 3, first there, right there. That first sentence, it starts with despite. Despite these strengths, the draft EIR has major limitations in that it lacks information necessary to fully support conclusions regarding impacts. That seems a really comprehensive statement. And I would say the word that was taken out was to fully support some conclusions or a subset of conclusions or something. Certainly, I wouldn't agree that the draft has limitations that it lacks to fully support all conclusions. So it's a qualifier in there. It's just a sentence or two that are like that. And but I think they're really meaningful differences, because that sentence right there just says the draft EIR doesn't support conclusions. And I don't think we're saying that in the broadest, most comprehensive way. How would you say that scientifically to be valid? I think you'd put qualifiers in there. Anyway, that's the two I want to bring up, but
yeah, I think these are valid concerns, Steve. We certainly, to me, the only common theme among all the members' comments is the science is uneven, not the science is always inadequate. So I think these are really good points that we can address. Okay, so before we go to break, why don't we check in and see if there are any public comments, and then we'll go to a 15-minute break.
Yes, we have one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, I've given you the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yes, with respect to the effects of climate change on the watershed, there is some very recent substantive research that shows that this is happening. So what's happened is the runoff efficiency in the Sacramento River watershed is now down to levels conversion of precipitation and runoff last seen at the end of the 1929 to 34 drought. And I looked into the reasons why. It's due to increased evapotranspiration in the watershed, and there's modeling by the U.S. Geological Survey that really is best available science that wasn't used. And it shows that the efficiency is decreasing both in the upper Colorado River Basin and in the Sierras. There's this shift in runoff efficiency. And it has to do with, it took quite a lot of effort for me to tease this out, but precipitation there's a moisture balance, and evaporated moisture isn't recycled in the Sierras. It's advected inland to the Great Basin. And for that reason, there's a net loss in moisture in the Sierras due to this increased evapotranspiration. And that's why we've got this drying, and it indicates that to the extent we have these hot droughts, there's a permanent change. There's a long-term shift. Similarly with the upper Colorado River Basin, the lower Colorado River Basin does more moisture recycling, and so that's probably why they don't. But there is a significant literature which I've been pulling together as rapidly as I can that shows so studies by UC Merced of forest in the Central Sierras, and they found a huge shift in runoff efficiency during dry years. But it's something we're only recently starting to understand, and it's this moisture balance that's driving why we had the extreme Southwest drought. It's why it's the worst in the last 1,200 years. And the other thing is that the global climate models don't capture this. So even the latest, greatest Earth system models underestimate the increase in evapotranspiration during droughts by 50%. And there's also feedbacks. The extreme precipitation in the Northwest there's recent study that shows that 40% of that, the extreme heat wave in the Northwest was caused by reduced soil moisture and so there was this nonlinear amplification of heat, and that probably also isn't caught in the models. And then there's another uncertainty in the models. The Climate Change Technical Advisory Group recommended using the full suite of 10 climate models, not just the central tendency. And when the Water Storage Investment Program, they recommended also looking at projections from the second driest model as well as the central tendency. And there's compelling reasons, not just because of this watershed drying, but also because there's some recent research. They used a single model, large ensemble, and they looked at the recent three-peat La Nina that we had, and we've had an overall forcing towards now, or we don't know if it's a forcing, but we've had an overall shift towards a lot more La Nina years in the Pacific over the last 20 years. 40% of the time we've had La Nina years, and these ensembles show there's less than a 5% chance. So there's this researcher at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder who's looking at this, and he's saying the models just aren't capturing. There's something the models aren't capturing, something in the pattern. And so the current extreme drought, where we have wet periods, but overall there seems to be a forcing towards La Nina conditions, could be anthropogenic forcing. And Wills thinks it could last to 5 to 10 years, or it could last a century or more. And that's really not clear. And it's also corroborated by some recent studies by Chinese researchers that found if you removed known model biases about sea surface temperatures, that there was a shift towards La Nina conditions, which are just drier on the West Coast. So anyway, there's a lot of evidence to show that we really need to be considering the drier conditions. And I apologize for not pulling it all together. There was just a lot. It's very, there's a lot of papers that have just been published in the last 2 years. And, but it really emphasizes, we've always known that there's this climate uncertainty, but the last 2 years and the drought developments we've seen, and the finding that we're in the worst drought in the last 1,200 years really points to that uncertainty. There's model uncertainty, and there's also internal variability, and we're not capturing that when we use the central tendency model. So thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Yeah, I think your concerns are very consistent with our concerns. And yeah, even though we keep learning new things, there's also the unknown unknowns. So I think we're all concerned that that sort of uncertainty is represented to the best of the agency's ability. So thank you. All right, so I have 20 of, more or less. Why don't we come back at 5 of the hour and be ready to discuss any other things, any other major content changes to either the appendix or the main report. And hopefully we can wrap this up before lunch. All right, thanks everyone. That 15 minutes did go by quickly.
Yes.
Okay, are we back live?
Yes, we are ready for you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So now that we've had a few minutes to think, that those 15 minutes did go by rather quickly, but if folks are ready, they can go ahead and suggest other ideas if they have other content changes. Tom.
One thing when I was rereading the document was the major concerns, the first one, 4.1 and 4.8, there's a lot of overlap in them. And I kind of wondered if they actually couldn't be combined into one and maybe start off with the concerns with that one. Right now, one of them's at the beginning and the other is at the end, which seems kind of strange for, I mean, there's sort of an implied priority, I guess, you know, when you make a list of things, you don't start with your weakest point. So yeah, I'd like to see if
can you say a little more? So for maybe Edmund could bring up the document again. 4.1 is that we thought the diversity of the alternatives was narrow, and then 4.8 was we thought different criteria could have been used to compare them, or just more generally, how the information was presented could have made the comparison more clear, I think is our main point. So yeah. Tell me more about why you see those two as so tightly linked.
Well, I could see them revising the document. There's a lot of unwritten history here, and I don't even know some of it, but just for the benefit of the board members, the idea of the Delta Conveyance Project actually goes back to the early proposals of the water supply system in California, and I don't know the reason it didn't get built initially. They, for some reason, maybe it was just the cost of it. It was cheaper to use the Delta sloughs as the waterway. But then in I think it was 1984. They proposed a Delta Conveyance Project that consisted of a surface water canal that went around the Delta, and the voters voted that down. And that there might be some legal reason as to why they can't consider it. That vote may have been essentially the end of that alternative.
Sure, yeah, and we recognize that. All we say is that it should be clear how they can, why this set is really our main comment.
This is sort of a long way of saying it. I could see them responding that by explaining better the legalities and the restraints they had in the alternatives they considered. And I think it gets to what 4.8 is trying to do, and why we could discuss this in just one major concern, I guess.
I will just share, I don't want to put any members on the spot, but I will say that, in 4.8, we have this comparison table that's really just meant to be a potential example, not meant to be what we think of as the best solution to the problem we raise. But basically that, it's pretty clear that some alternatives are outperforming other alternatives, and there are quantitative criteria that vary more across projects than other criteria. So some criteria are the same across all alternatives, some really vary. And so this table is just what some called a notional example, just an idea of how the information could have been summarized more effectively. And but yet some people retain some discomfort with the idea that we are somehow selecting which metrics are most important, when really what's represented here is what was quantified, very clearly quantified and varied across the project. So I think there's some concern about putting this up front in terms of, this is what you should have done, will come across more strongly, as opposed to, we see a lot of need to reorganize, given all these important scientific omissions, it would also be nice if the information had been easier to access. And so I don't know, my feeling is it may belong here, but I'm certainly open to other comments. Obey.
What? Let me make one more point on this.
Okay, go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
One possibility would simply to move 4.8 so that it follows 4.1, because the subject of both of these is alternatives, and they're separated by the 6 other major concerns.
Okay, let's take that under consideration. Obey.
Yes, probably not directly related to what Tom is asking, but the last sentence in 4.1, references some earlier popular versions of alternatives. Are we referring to earlier popular versions of tunnel alternatives, or is the peripheral canal, for example, that was discussed early on, is that part of that? And it'll be nice to have some kind of a citation in here. I don't know if we have it, but.
Yeah, also, I don't know how we know they were popular.
Yeah,
that's what I'm worried about. Yeah, Tanya's gonna make same thing. Yeah. I think we're all looking at this with fresh eyes. Yeah, I think we should omit the word popular, not having evidence of that. I think it was more that it was a common recommendation. So I think that's really the point of this whole section, is what happened to the Western alternatives. So let's not belabor that. I think it's,
well, we know one alternative was unpopular by the vote of the public.
But that's really not our place to say. All we meant to say was, from a decision science perspective, you're supposed to be looking at all potential solutions, all feasible potential solutions. What happened to these other ones? Why did they just suddenly disappear? So we definitely need to get rid of things that suggest we have information we don't have. I don't know if we're going to be able to find a citation, but we can certainly try. Other comments, Tanya.
Well, I guess to address maybe Tom's point, we could just move 4.1 down to come right before 4.8 rather than moving 4.8 up. I feel like 4.1 and 4.8 aren't really getting it. Well, I think 4.8 has more importance perhaps than 4.1. I mean, 4.1 is asking for more explanation for why they didn't include certain range of alternatives, but doesn't get into kind of the meat of the science around the alternatives that they did review. And so to me, some of these other concerns are a higher priority. And if we're trying to convey something with the ordering of these points, I don't know, maybe 4.2 comes first.
Steve? Steve, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. There has been discussion in the past about the order of these and making a statement of whether or not they're all equal. But I do agree with Tanya's suggestion. I think that makes a lot of sense. To me, the 4.8 purpose was largely that the presentation style was confounding. And I think that we've made that point in every single one of these before, and I think we're just remaking it. The table, moving the table up, I think would be confusing because people would start saying, well, have they reanalyzed the data? Where do these numbers come from? And I know that was my first reaction when I saw those. So I would support Tanya's suggestion is to move 4.1 to 4.7.
Any other comments? Yeah, that makes sense to me. Anyone have a problem with that? I don't see any grimaces in the crowd, so let's do it. Okay, so an elegant solution to that concern. Is there anything else? Any other major content issues people want to raise? Steve, Steve, is your hands left over, or is that a new?
New. It's not a. It's probably not so much a content as reordering it. If you read the very last paragraph, just kind of ends, and it just seems like it should go beyond the very last paragraph. And I'm just going to suggest this is maybe where we can handle the appendix now, part 2. That's where we. I mean, that's just the end of that last thing. And maybe what we say here is that, this summarizes our basic conclusions that cut across all the chapters, and part 2 is includes more specifics. And that's where we put that sentence in there so at least there's some sort of conclusion or ending.
Sounds good to me. Any concerns about that? Okay, Bob, why don't you go ahead?
Well, first of all, I agree with Steve, and it does need some sort of instrumentary paragraph or sentence to introduce part 2. I have a concern. I don't know how important it is, but it relates to the fact that they did not address the need for environmental flows in either chapters 5 or 6, surface waters and water supply. And I read those chapters, and I wrote to Jay separately about this, is that as near as I could find, there was no mention in these chapters, and I don't believe there was any mention of environmental flows anywhere in the report. Maybe there could have been, but I don't know now. But it seems to me that having a discussion of how this project would impact environmental flows and having the water to actually do the types of restoration that are needed in the coming years would be vitally important. And either in our comments on chapter 5 or 6, or maybe even later on in chapters 12 and 13, we really should try and address this omission in a paragraph or so. So I just throw that out for folks to consider.
Yeah, Bob, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. So we have some discussion of loss of riparian areas. We have some that are obviously related to flow. We have some issues with respect to fish queuing and things like that. So can you tell me more about what's missing? I may not understand exactly what you mean by environmental flows.
Well, having the water available at the right times and in the right amounts not only to maintain those populations and those functions in the system, but also when we look at the recent eco amendments to the Delta plan, where they're proposing to add tens of thousands of acres. Admittedly, most of these are above the intakes, but having the ability to do that really, and if I recall correctly, the main tool for doing that is having the flows available, having environmental flows that can fulfill those needs. But in this particular document, there is no discussion of how the diversions through the tunnel will potentially impact environmental flows, or even if that's a non-consideration based on the physical structure of the tunnels. But it seems to me it should be addressed somewhere in the document. And the fact that it was never mentioned in the surface water and the hydrology chapters leaves me concerned. And I apologize, I guess, to you and to Steve and the others. It was something that when I was reviewing the earlier version of part 2 that I didn't pick up on. And it was only the last couple of days that I recalled that, you know, that was an important comment that I sent to Jay at the time.
Obe, do you want to make a comment about this topic? You're muted.
Yeah, just I wanted to ask, maybe have some clarification, Bob. You know, there is in the modeling, they had what they call model flow required for model DO. So I was wondering if that was part of that, you know, discussion somewhere. So, which means that the operations of the tunnels would consider what is required for, you know, meeting the DO requirements in Delta. I don't know if that was, I didn't read that very careful, but I was curious if you had seen that.
And so I saw that, and certainly dissolved oxygen is would be one component of environmental flows. But also it's so much more than just oxygen. It really relates to how populations respond,
right.
How the kind of the biophysical structure of the environment affected at appropriate times of the year, and in the ways that would really help balance, I would say, water demands from the Delta, along with the environmental promises that have been made for the coming decades.
Yeah, I agree on that. Yeah, I just saw that in the output.
I wonder if the issue, oh, go ahead, Diane.
I was going to say that maybe this could be brought up under the general topic of adaptive management planning is inadequate, because one of the areas, you know, is there enough water to adapt is one of the questions I remember having, that cuts across a number of areas.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
And I think that's a good suggestion. It could certainly go there as well as in chapters 5 and 6.
Yeah, so I wonder if this, I still would really like to know which impacts are not being covered. I think perhaps, I could be totally wrong here, that the environmental flows got pieced apart. And so maybe you're looking for something more comprehensive and holistic, but there was discussion of how flows would affect many different things, and how the fact that monthly average flows were being used instead of daily flows, so that you might lose some of the variability, an understanding of the variability. So to me, we talk a lot about the relevance of how flow is characterized to habitat concerns. Is it that we just haven't really recognized the fact that it's the whole pattern that can affect so many things that we may not have mentioned? Is that really what's missing?
I think that is missing, as well as in their analyses of surface water and hydrology, that the authors of the report, or the authors that did the analyses, did not seem to really consider environmental flows. Yet we bring it up later on, like you say, by taking a more comprehensive look at the environmental aspects of, or the environmental side of the system. And we bring out lots of examples where flows are important. But I think also on our end, we have not tied it together, perhaps with a title or a theme under environmental flows. You know, that I think we need to keep that phrase or that term on the table. It's an important one going forward for the Delta plan, eco amendments to the Delta plan.
Steve.
So I'm going to challenge Edmund on here on chapters on page 59, bottom page 59 of the part 2. I think, Bob, a lot of that concept is included, particularly in the chapter 12 review, but the term itself, e-flows, may not be, environmental flows may not have been used. And but I think the concept is there in at least a couple of paragraphs. And if Edmund can get to that, and it's under the topic of sort of the depth and breadth of the scientific evaluation. And the bottom, yeah, that whole paragraph that you have right there talks about, you know, reduced flow is not beneficial to most ecosystem impacts or fundamental issues that need to be addressed. The ecosystem analyses are conducted entirely on species by species, dilutes the merit of evaluating the project from an ecosystem perspective, and so forth, and may reduce ecological resilience. And if you go to the top of page 60, the that next really 2 paragraphs kind of, I think, captures that, looking at cumulative effects and those kinds of things. It just doesn't use the term itself. If that.
You know, I think it's there, Steve, and but like you say, we don't use the term, and I think we do need to use the term to keep it on the table. Otherwise, it's one of those things that tends to get lost in the rest of the conversation. And in looking, you know, going forward or looking more forward, I think it's going to be a term that's or a concept that's going to be used a lot in the coming years, and it should not be overlooked in this document. So if there's a way we can perhaps you know, add a few words here and there, that'll be important. But I think also as an omission in chapters 5 and 6, it should be pointed out that environmental flows don't appear to be considered at all in their analyses.
And would there be, if we stuck it in also in chapter 12 and just referred to it, is there, because as you know, environmental flows, flows, natural flows, there's various definitions and terminology. Is there a specific reference that would be useful to cite?
Sure, I can give you one. Probably Angela Arthington's book and the papers that she has provide a really nice overview of all the various terms, the synonyms that are in use today.
And then the one we would be referring to would be adopting that as, in a sense, as environmental flows, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that would be useful.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to say see a pretty succinct definition as opposed to a book, if possible. Just sort of what do we mean that they didn't include? Because I do think it could likely be just a division of labor, how they think about these things, since there are all these control rules that are intended to protect habitat. Now, whether or not they do is, I think, a really good question to be asking. So I think the fact to just say they weren't addressed at all may just be putting on blinders to some of the other operational evaluations that they do. So I just want to be really clear what impacts we think are not addressed. I think that would be helpful to clarify. Tom, you have something to add?
Yeah, when I read that paragraph that Steve was just describing, I thought there were really two very different thoughts. I'm not a biologist, but the species specific and the ecosystem specific were very different. And so I think working the E-flow into the latter would be a reasonable way to handle this.
Yeah, I think it would be great to use the term, define it well, and put it and separate out that issue for
Yeah.
chapter 12. That sounds great to me. I have more concern about saying it wasn't addressed in other chapters, because there is a lot couched in this language of control rules. So I think we should be really clear, like that the control rules did not fully evaluate environmental flows, or just say more specifically what kind of impacts aren't being addressed, and through those plans to do control rules and the current methods of adaptive management. So. Okay. Well, how about any other topics? I think this reads very well. I think all the comments that have been made so far will definitely help it. I know the appendix does have a lot more details than the main report, and I really hope folks are gonna, part 2, I really do hope that folks will also take a good look at part 2, because I do think there's a lot of important comments in there that are certainly relevant to doing effective mitigation of a wide range of social effects and things like that. I guess I just would ask Tanya at this point, sort of the last thing on my list was, did we ignore any social effects that we should have elevated? And Virginia too worked on some of those social chapters. Steve, are we missing something from the social chapters that should be elevated to the main chapters?
I mean, I think the cross-cutting themes we touched on, sorry, my dogs.
It's okay, we hear you.
Cross-cutting themes, and I think the key points that come out in the individual social chapter sections are articulated well. I think fortunately those chapter reviews are concise enough that hopefully they don't take too much time to get through, but I don't see any major issues that should be, like you said, elevated into the cross-cutting themes, but I don't know, I could be missing something.
Got a yip there at the end. Yeah, I think that it's hard to meet that bar of cross-cutting when that's kind of a little bit of a siloed issue, or many of the issues are kind of siloed. Again, doesn't mean we don't think those aren't important. So hopefully the part 1, part 2 will help clarify that aspect. All right, well, at this point then, if folks are comfortable that this set of changes will lead us to a solid document, then I would seek a motion to approve the content and allow Steve and I to address the remaining comments.
I move to approve the content and allow Steve and Lisa to address the remaining comments. I don't know if I said that motion correctly.
Yeah, I gotta double check. Steve, am I missing something on process? Oh, do we need to do public comment before we vote?
We need a motion and a second, and then public comments on the motion.
Thank you, Edmund.
I second.
Is the motion sufficient, Edmund?
Yes, unless you want a recap of suggestions.
I think we got it.
Okay.
Oh, recap the suggestions. Yeah, they're relatively straightforward. Virginia.
So I second Tanya's motion.
Okay, great. We have a second. So all those in favor, please.
Public comments first.
Oh, public comments. Thank you. Okay, do we
Yeah.
have public comments?
Yes, we have public comments. And for those who are on the line, please use the raise hand function in Zoom if you have a public comment on this item. And also feel free to email us at disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. We currently see 2 raised hands, and we'll go in this following order with OSHA, then Deirdre. Feel free to briefly introduce yourself before providing your public comment, but this is strictly optional. And OSHA, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Hello, hi, I'm Ocean Reserve, and I work with several local Delta groups, including local agencies of the North Delta. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
My phone starts ringing. I'm hanging up on them. I haven't had a chance to review your draft thoroughly, but I believe that there could be an item that probably should be included somewhere, and obviously you are all world-renowned scientists, but I think the Delta plan does include a specific definition for best available science. And so I'm a bit concerned that that is not specifically referenced in your comments, and I think it should be. I mean, like I said, I think you all have experience to know what that is, but the Delta plan did define that in the CCR 23-5000F, I believe, and then there's an appendix 1A of the Delta plan that has a further definition of best available science, which talks about the objectives and the model and some meat around that that was adopted at the time of the Delta plan adoption, which has not been changed since then. So, and I think it goes off of, it kind of tracks the federal standard from the National Research Council, which I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, but I guess I just am a little concerned that that definition, as well as the definition within the Delta plan of adaptive management. I know there is a discussion of adaptive management in the draft, but I think that specifically referencing the adaptive management as defined in the Delta plan would likely be appropriate. So that's the main thing I wanted to convey to you today. Thank you for considering my comment.
Thank you, OSHA. You know, as you know, many of us are not people who routinely work in the Delta, and they're not necessarily familiar with the local definitions. I think what we have done is addressed whether the science and the adaptive management are adequate, you know, relative to other projects we've worked on, relative to what we understand to be state of the science. And, you know, there is this additional review that comes later about whether the EIR is consistent with the Delta plan. And so I think our intent is that our comments could then be used by those who really understand that definition to say whether or not there is concurrence there, rather than us necessarily trying to parse the language. But I think we can take this under advisement and continue thinking about it. But that would, if we don't add that language, I would say that's the reason why, but I think we can definitely consider that. Can we have our next comment? Oh, Steve wants to say something. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I think that, of course, the definition I'm aware is the use of best available science, which is decision specific. And but the elements of best that they use to define best available science, like the use of models and appropriate objectives and assumptions and all that stuff, I don't have those clearly, but I think if you look at our review, we've hit on those 5 things that comprise the elements of best available science.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say, just less succinctly. Thank you, Steve. Okay, can we move on to the second comment?
Yes, our next one is with Deirdre. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I did want to say, I do have concerns that the Delta Science Board wasn't briefed on best available science definitions in the Delta plan, or and those requirements, and they are very specific. And to the extent that you intend that someone else, another review panel do it, I don't think it's appropriate to have a state agency do that review, and I think it should be an independent panel. Also, I wanted to note that the CEQA deadline is not the same as the deadline for the review for best available science. So I think it's just really an important process point that if you haven't been able to review it for compliance with the Delta plan requirements because you haven't been briefed specifically on those. And I did send a letter to the Delta Stewardship Council's council because another issue is the legal support for the board's work. And there are some very important definitions in your oversight roles, and the definition of best available science and being clear on what that is, and also on adaptive management, and then an actual plan is required. But you really need a state attorney to brief it. I mean, we did have, I did have a pro bono attorney who was helping, but the board really needs that kind of support. I would also add that relevant to Bob Nyman's comment, just the availability of flows for ecosystems and not appropriating them is a key consideration of the water board. And I don't think that the briefing of the board by the water board was sufficient. There actually are specific requirements in the Delta Reform Act for inclusion of appropriate Delta flow criteria in the order approving the permit. And it was an intent of the legislature. And I did ask call this to attention of some of the NGO attorneys. And I did hope that one of them would help do a briefing. I didn't have time to compile that by myself, but again, I think it's really important to be clear. The board just wasn't briefed on these requirements. And you can't evaluate things. You evaluated things as best you could based on your knowledge of what other panels and NEPA requirements, and CEQA is similar to NEPA. But it's just a very clear kind of gap. And I think it's just important to note that the board just didn't receive briefings on this by, someone with the appropriate legal background. Because you're not, you were all given a copy of the Delta Reform Act, but you're not attorneys, you're eminent scientists. So thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. You certainly raised some interesting institutional issues. And I think perhaps the appropriate time to address those is moving forward. You can't change the past. So certainly appreciate those comments. Laurel, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to remind everyone here that Karen Kafetz did provide the ISB with a briefing, a very detailed briefing on what constitutes best available science at the kickoff meeting in August. And so those materials should be part of the record and available online to anyone who would like to see them.
Yeah, I can confirm that we had a discussion about that. I also think that perhaps, I hate to speak for everyone on the board, but I know at least some of us feel that it's our job just to use what we have seen in terms of effective and feasible science for making these kinds of decisions and rate this science according to that, rather than concerning ourselves with exactly what the policymakers see as the constraints on that. And so I think like we knowingly said things that we know are fall outside CEQA. And it wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of, well, we don't necessarily agree that the criteria are appropriate. So we really are independent in the sense of we're not going to control our thinking according to policy. We are really looking at it from a scientific perspective. And so I think this is the way the board should operate rather than worrying about the legal definitions. But just because we, as you say, we're not lawyers and we're only going to do so well at reading that kind of stuff would be my suggestion. But I do think the issue of having a state agency review things versus an independent science board is an interesting question that we should potentially look at from an institutional perspective. So thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And just a quick correction, the presentation was in June, not August. In case anyone would like to find it.
Okay, all right. So I think any other comments now that we've heard public comment about any other changes? Okay, I think we did hear what folks said, and we're not going to ignore those comments. But in terms of delivering this document by December 16th, it's probably best if we move forward with our current content unless anyone's very uncomfortable. So hearing no objections, I think not just our current content, but our current content plus the changes that we've talked about, reordering, putting in more information about environmental flows. Let's see, I'm going to do a quick recap just to make sure we're voting with knowledge here. Adding about toxic chemical contaminants that hadn't been well addressed, clarifying what we mean by optimistic assumptions, spelling out more specifically that that's a 3-part, 4.3 is a 3-part element, and explaining a bit more about what it was going to add something reflecting the fact that there are changing hydrologic parameters that are another example of more systemic climate change that hasn't necessarily been well incorporated, or at least not from what we can tell. So those are really our changes at this point. So with that in mind, all those in favor of approving this draft with those changes, please signify by saying aye.
We have to go on individual roll call.
Oh, we do individual vote. Sorry. Okay, thanks. Oh, Diane has a comment. I'm sorry, Diane. I just noticed your hand.
No, I was just raising my hand to agree. So
okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm just going to go in the order on my screen just to avoid having to think about alphabetical order. So Diane is a yes. Obey.
Yes.
Obey. This is Obey. Yes.
Inga. You're muted.
Yes.
Thank you, Inga. Virginia.
Yes.
Steve.
Yes.
Tanya.
Yes.
Bob.
Yes.
Anna.
Yes.
And I think that's everyone. Okay, and Lisa, yes. The motion passes unanimously, and Steve and I will get to work. We will provide a letter to DWR explaining what we're delivering and what its significance. If you have any particular comments you would like incorporated in that letter, feel free to send those to me. Edmund, are there any other steps we need to discuss?
No, I think you've covered it.
Okay, good. It's always good to check in as my process knowledge is still limited.
So Lisa, has Tom disappeared or did he have to leave?
Yeah, I knew someone was missing. What happened to Tom? I know nothing about why Tom disappeared. Could be internet problems. So Tom is a no-show on that vote. Okay, I don't know if you have Tom, we can see if it's not too late to add him. Okay, so we are well ahead of schedule. Good job. I'm glad that we didn't drag this out too much. I think we can certainly fix other editing issues that people have without having to discuss them publicly, painfully. So we do have one more topic, which is, well, really two. So we need to discuss our work plan moving forward, getting back on track to do other reviews and do other projects. And I want to discuss the schedule. So I think the question at this point is, would folks like to power through and hold lunch? Or would you like to take lunch now and we'll come back to discuss the work plan? So, I mean, basically the work plan discussion will be about ideas people want to move forward, how we want to move those forward, and just letting you know some of the scheduling that we're expected to produce an annual work plan for the Delta Stewardship Council. So it's probably a conversation we could have unless folks are very hungry before lunch. What do folks think? If you agree with continuing the conversation, raise your hand. I'm not getting complete consensus here. Bob, you okay with continuing the conversation? You'd rather take a break. How about if we take a short break and then continue? Does that help? Yeah, okay, that helps. All right, so let's, it's again to almost 20 of. Why don't we take a 15-minute break and then come back at 5 of the hour.
Just note, I did schedule a brief meeting during part of the original lunch hour. Okay. So if we could have at least on Pacific time, either the 12 to 12:30 or the 12:30 to 1 as part of our lunch, that would work. But if we take a short break now and then reconvene from 12 to 1, then that won't work for me, unfortunately.
I see.
So either, like I said, as long as I could have either the original half hour, 12:30 to 1, or a half hour earlier, that would work great. Otherwise, I'm completely flexible.
So at least I think we're only scheduled for another 30 minutes of activity. So if we could reconvene at 5 or 10 then we should be done by 12:30.
That's what I was going to say too. Yeah. Okay. So let's try to come back at 10 of to make sure we have enough time to cover things and public comment by 12:30.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. See you all in a bit. Please do turn on your camera if you're back. Edmund, do I need to do public comment about the vote? Or because we did public comment before the vote, we're done with that agenda item?
We're done with that agenda item.
Okay, the detailed agenda was a little bit confusing on that score.
Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're back. We're back. Okay, very good. Thanks, everyone. So now comes the fun part. I think this is the fun part. It's like the proposal phase. Some of us already have some things in the works, and then really now is a time where we have some breathing room to develop new ideas. We have, okay, let's see. I have some official things to say. Let's see what's our goal? Our goal with this agenda item 7 is to get back to the reviews that were put on hold, revisit, whether things are going to move forward in some cases, and develop our work plan for the year 2023. So probably in March of 2023, if we can schedule it, possibly February of 2023, I will make a presentation to the Delta Stewardship Council that lays out our plan for the year, including major milestones. So as part of your packet, you saw what this typically looks like. And so what we really need, for those of you who do have ongoing activities, the lead person should try to work up a timeline if at all possible and send major milestones to the staff so they can work on that work plan. And yeah, that's really where we're headed. So I think it's probably worth spending some time right now, just if folks want to weigh in or ask questions. I do think we don't really have time at this meeting to really discuss a lot of new ideas. It's probably useful. I wonder if even Steve wants to give a recap of sources of suggestions we've gotten that folks may want to look at prior to our next meeting. And there may even be a product coming out that would help. But for the most part, we're looking for folks to float some ideas that we can discuss, in addition to just working on what we've already started or abandoning what we've already started. So let's yeah, Tanya, should I let Steve go first, or do you have a burning comment?
So just a question. Could we have a quick recap of each of the review efforts we have kind of ongoing already that have been on the back burner?
Yeah, that was my intent. Yeah, but Steve, yeah, let's start there, and then Steve can help us know about other things that can help us look at other topics if interested. So first, well, one of the topics is the one we already discussed this morning, the Futures Project. So that that group will set up some milestones and try to move that forward. Tom, do you want to discuss the activity you're leading?
Sure. Just having trouble unmuting there. What was formerly called the Subsidence Reversal Group. After talk, we had 4 briefing group discussions with, I guess you could call them stakeholders. They were really informative, and it's clear that what we were talking about with subsidence reversal was just a piece of a greater effort in the Delta to re-wet the soils, to either stabilize the land surface or in some cases actually reverse it. So we're basically done with the discussion with the stakeholders. I think we're going to focus on re-wetting, and probably the biggest challenge we have is that some of the science is pretty obvious. For example, the carbon sequestration by the soils in the Delta when they're re-wet is very important. But there's a strong economic component in that the landowners in the Delta, there has to be an economic incentive for them to re-wet. And we've got to somehow wrap our heads around that issue. Because it's driven primarily by farmers who have their own, I'll call it, approach to how they're going to make decisions, and they tend to make decisions longer term than from an economic perspective that really affects how they make the choices they do. So anyway, I've distributed a little outline to the group of what a workshop would look like, and our next plan is to get together hopefully before our next meeting and actually see if we can sort of chart the path forward. So that's where we are right now.
Yes, just to be clear, Tom, you've got a couple folks working with you, and that's who you're distributing to this to. It's not going to the whole group yet because we'll do that publicly. So, and yeah, also just in case for some of the newer members, the overarching goal here is to look at ways to prevent peatland degradation, I guess, is one way to think of these. Peat soils can benefit a lot from being re-wetted. There's many good effects. So that's just the very generic overview. And then, but they've been digging deeply into aspects of this that might require additional science or thinking that the board could help with. So,
and I think this will be the first time we've really looked at it globally. People are looking at pieces of it. For example, they look at it from a levee stability perspective. Subsidence reversal has had its own efforts, but what's pretty clear is when you look around in the Delta, there's really a global effort to re-wet the soils. And the farming piece is probably going to be the biggest challenge.
Anyone want to add anything else to that topic? Diane.
Well, I was just noticing a couple days ago that the Western senators have formed a committee and are talking to the Department of Interior about the ongoing drought. And there seems to be this issues like rewetting the Delta are getting higher and higher priority at the national level.
Interesting. Okay, I'm aware of one other effort. Steve, do you want to talk about the SNA?
Sure, I can do that. The science needs assessment is something that we had been involved in for a number of years. We're sort of in the wrapping up stage of that. We're putting together 2 documents, basically. One document is a summary of all of the various panels and workshops we had and what came out of those to look at the overall science needs assessment. That will just be a report. Lillian and Christina are really taking the lead and putting that together right now. And then that would come back and that would just be a report of what we did. The second component of it would be to have some very specific recommendations that came out of that deliberations that would go to DPEC. And that is something we'd be bringing back to the board as a whole to look at and see if it's something we as a board would agree that it would be moving forward. That is various drafts of that have been had. There's some discussion of it at board meetings. It largely relates to putting together some forecasting capabilities and bring that back to DPEC. So, but on a larger note, I'm wondering, you asked before about what we've done in the past, and in some sense, we've had various retreats. We call them retreats, 2 or 3, if not more, retreats where we have had an opportunity to have discussions about new reviews, where we ought to go, and so forth. Some of those were based on surveys we did with the public. I think we might have done 2 different surveys to try and get their sense on topics that need to be reviewed. We also had open meetings and discussions, and even panel members that have come and talked to us about that. So there's a lot of background material, but we have new board members now, and obviously the system continues to evolve. So wondering if we're going to have a sort of a more formalized process to move forward. That's one note. And the other review that Lisa and I are working on, and along with the postdocs as well, is food webs. If you recall back sometime before EIR, we had a panel on halves, and we had a panel on food webs. And the food web stuff is, we're still moving forward with that and thinking still in the concept of a workshop. And but we need to refine sort of the scope and topic, but that still is being moved forward as a potential review. And HABs, I don't know, Diane, because we were going to wait till after the HABs monitoring workshop and to see whether or not there was still room for us to have valuable input on that topic.
And I apologize, I haven't stayed up to date on that, but they've just had a debrief from their workshop, and so we could potentially follow up on with the leader of that effort and get a sense from them. But I haven't been able to stay as engaged with that as I had originally planned. Thanks.
And Diane, if you do reach out to that group, if you'd like another person involved, I'd be happy to participate.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good idea. And this area is rapidly evolving in terms of new science.
So Laurel, is there will there be a report out of that workshop? Laurel Larson?
We're putting Laurel on the spot.
Sorry, I had some other windows on top and had to find the unmute button. Yes, there will be a report from that workshop. Right now we're trying to identify a lead author that we will compensate to write that report, but so we're looking at still a few months out, but there will be.
Yeah, and then we had that question about, since that group was very focused on monitoring and rapid response kind of ideas, that where was the opportunity for us to do some more long-term thinking about science needs to support HAB prevention and HAB management. So yeah, I think that just to crystallize what that, where we are with that is wait to see their scope, and then we'll figure out what our scope could be. And I guess maybe now's a good time to mention that there are a lot of topics floating around that have been advanced to varying degrees. And so it's not necessarily that we need a lot of new ideas. I think we need to decide which of the ones that are already floating around we need to move forward with. And also, just for the benefit of the new members, I think we're trying to think about a diversity of product types. So in the past, we've spent a long time and written fairly long documents that review the science and make recommendations. Increasingly, we're being told it'd be nice if those were shorter. And we also have started to see that there are other ways to generate findings, such as, why don't we have a workshop where we let different perspectives be presented and then we write that up, and rather than going off into the literature and doing our own research. So I think, and then we've also had a lot of impact with relatively short letters that just very quickly summarized an opportunity to apply science. And so I think, you know, it is important to remember that if you are interested in a topic, we're not necessarily tying you to a very long, involved process if you want to go this route of organizing a workshop or doing a brief, like a short letter or something. So these are some options. Let's see. Should we? I'll maybe put people on the spot. There was also the topic of e-flows. Bob, would you like to give us a little update on that?
Well, e-flows, environmental flows. I think it was back in our meeting in August or September, we actually started to gain some traction here, and within the group started to put forward an initial plan of how we would proceed, you know, come November, December, January, and so forth. That, of course, was derailed by the Conveyance Project. And honestly, I haven't really thought about it since then. I need to go back and revisit that and refamiliarize myself with the, I would say, the steps we were proposing for going forward. But I will say, for the benefit of those new in the group, one of the catalysts for moving forward with this was the eco amendments to the Delta plan, which were approved, and their target being adding somewhere between 70 and 80,000 acres of habitat to the Delta. And the major tool by which this will be done will be through environmental flows. And that raises all sorts of questions about, first of all, is the water available? Is it available in the right amounts at the right time of year? How will it be used? And so forth. And I think this group being ISB, has an opportunity here to really help not lead, but guide this effort in good ways, using the available science that's been done on environmental flows in various parts of the world, and bring it to bear here within the Delta. So now that the Conveyance Project is really almost finished, I'll return to my notes and hopefully have something more concrete to say to everybody at our January or February meetings. So, I don't know if there's any questions at all. That would be a good time to answer them and get my brain working again on equal.
I think we all feel a little bit foggy after doing this EIR, Bob. So I think it is the right time to just get the question straight and move forward. And just to reiterate, what we're looking for at this point is if people do want to move these ideas forward, they should start to come up with some milestones and send those to staff. And so January is kind of our opportunity to do some work on that. We're planning a virtual meeting right now. So probably a relatively short meeting because we won't be getting some of our normal updates yet. And so we really want folks to just, use any spare time they have for Delta ISB on advancing some of these ideas. Virginia, what you got?
So we had also talked about, based on the conveyance report, to put a short letter together on how CEQA makes it hard to do these assessments from a science perspective.
Mm.
Weren't you part of those discussions, Lisa?
Yeah, forgot about that. Yeah, I think we do want to stay in our lane of science, but certainly there are institutional science issues and other issues that come up. So I think we need to think about how to scope that in a way that we're sure we're evaluating a scientific question, right? So if Virginia, you have interest in leading that, I guess that would be a next step. She's not. She's begging off quickly.
I almost didn't bring it up.
If you bring up an idea, you got to be willing to carry it forward. All right. Well, we'll just throw that out to the group, and I think we all we learned a lot about CEQA in reviewing the EIR, and now perhaps we have some thoughts. So, but just in terms of, I would think that the opportunity there is to compare it to how science is being used, particularly maybe some of the issues of climate change. So the board in the past has wrote a letter that was fairly influential that said, we really need to be thinking about how to respond more rapidly to changing conditions, climate change, and I think CEQA is an example of an institutional issue that may prevent some of the best science application potentially. I haven't analyzed it yet. I'm just saying. So that would potentially be the angle.
So I could add, I brought this up to a colleague whose whole career has been doing NEPA and has dealt a lot with CEQA. And she was quite enthusiastic about the idea because it's hindered her efforts.
Yeah, I think our EIR review also brings up some issues just in terms of why aren't we comparing benefits costs? How are these trade-offs being evaluated? There's so many questions to how decisions are being supported through the science. So yeah, it's certainly interesting from a decision science perspective, I'll tell you that. Okay, so let's talk about the upcoming meetings. Any other, well, I guess we actually should take public comments on this topic first. Before we move on.
Yeah, we have one public comment from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the reviews that the Delta Independent Science Board is doing. And one of the things I'm going to send to all, there's an AGU session on co-production of knowledge, but one of the things I've noticed that's really a gap in the Delta Science Program advisory groups is that none of them are public, none of them are noticed, and a lot of them don't necessarily include representatives from environmental and fishing groups or even local Delta interests. And so there's a real gap with co-production of knowledge in the Delta Science Program. And I do really appreciate the Delta ISB's efforts, like for the interviews about subsidence reversal. And I think it's really important going forward, and we're going to be trying to look at how that might be better funded, because there's a lot of knowledge in these other communities. The other thing I wanted to recommend is that there's a lot of collaborative work between the Department of Water Resources and the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. at UC San Diego, which has, you know, some of the top climate scientists in California working on forecasting of atmospheric rivers and analysis of droughts. And they've done a huge amount of work. And you might consider trying to arrange a briefing. I think that there's a real gap also in inclusion of climate scientists in these efforts, and particularly I noticed that with the science needs assessment, there actually is a lot of what Steve talked about. There is a lot of forecasting tools that are being developed. They're just, and some of them are really, really good and really important. So there just isn't communication about this and the Delta. And I think that would be really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. I think those are all, you know, points that we've been trying to address since the Hastings et al. Report, as we like to refer to it, you know, that this need to really stay in touch with stakeholder needs and consider other sources of information and knowledge. And this is definitely something that we consider important. So we will thank you for that comment. Okay, so
And we also
yeah.
have another public comment.
Oh, okay.
From Lawrence Abbott. Lawrence, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been really interesting to follow along here. I just wanted to note that, you know, I agree that you're a science board, so your focus is on science. But excuse my ignorance, I don't know your all individual backgrounds. I did hear earlier in the meeting that some of you specifically said that you're not biologists. And I'm just really curious if you guys have sort of a balance of the sciences on your board, and especially my primary interest is in ecology and ecosystems in biology and all the things that have been happening in the Delta with regard to you know, loss of biodiversity, fragmentation, local extirpations and extinctions, and just environmental degradation in general for ecosystems and biology. So I'm just hoping that I didn't hear a lot of that, but I'm sure that you guys do have that. I'm new to this process. So I just wanted to flag that and make sure that that is a high priority and that the sciences are balanced when you're looking at the Delta. So because you know, when you say focus on science, if you include ecology, that's pretty broad, right? So I hope that's happening. Pass.
Well, thanks. I see Diane wants to comment, but I will just quickly note that Virginia Dale is a landscape ecologist, and our bios are out there if you want to learn our diverse expertise. But with 10 people, you can only be so deep. So Diane, what's your comment?
I just want to explain that one reason I was late to this meeting is it was the review for the final for my class on applied stream ecology. I'm very involved in the LTR network, and I teach undergraduates in environmental engineering intro to applied ecology. So we think very seriously about ecology.
Yeah, there are more ecologists than there are not ecologists, and Anna's here as our climate scientist, among other skills. Anna, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that, yeah, so my personal expertise is in climate science, harmful algal blooms and so on, but I'm also the director of the Department of Global Ecology at the Carnegie Institution for Science. And so my close colleagues are sort of a very diverse group of ecologists. And so to Lisa's point, although there's a limit to how much expertise can be present among the 10 members, I'm sure that the same is true for others, that we're really sort of part of broader scientific networks and can sort of leverage outside expertise as well. That being said, I think, you know, additional input is always welcome.
Yeah, so it's possible that our comments didn't reflect a lot of ecology because we've had those discussions first. So, yeah, Virginia.
Well, I could add, you know, at a high level, a lot of the comments we made earlier about a systems perspective were really related to a ecosystem perspective and a landscape perspective and trying to think about those kind of issues. So we didn't get into the details today, but that's some of the topics that we're trying to cover when we use those kind of code words, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. A lot's going on in our heads when we say simple things sometimes. Yeah, but thank you. We appreciate that. And we always want to hear if people think we're ignoring things. So that's a helpful comment.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so with that, I will close this topic of work plan development and just let people know that we would really like to see some timelines, ideally, maybe even proposed timelines by the next meeting or the end of January. I'll give us a little extra time since it's the holidays, but we are trying to build up to that work plan. And so if you're leading an effort, please see what you can do to move such scheduling forward and with products and timelines, expected products. I mean, you know, and of course we can adapt as we move forward, but it's nice to have a plan. Okay, so the next agenda item is 8, preparing for upcoming Delta ISB meetings. So we did not necessarily reach consensus, but it did seem that we had a preponderance of folks that preferred to meet quarterly rather than every month or every other month in person. So we are currently operating under that assumption that we're only meeting in person quarterly, but we can schedule in-person meetings should there be a need. That does make it a little difficult to do what Steve wanted, which is kind of have a retreat where we can discuss new topics, but maybe it's a good way to move forward to just get our arms around what we already committed to doing, or at least partially committed to doing, and fish or cut bait on those before we start discussing new ideas. So I think if we use the January virtual meeting to really come down, you know, be clear about what list we're really moving forward and in what manner, that will be helpful. And then the current proposed date, well, I don't know, we don't have that on my schedule. Okay, so you'll hear about the current proposed date. We were not anticipating a long meeting just because we're still getting our bearings post EIR. There's also a plan for a virtual February meeting and then an in-person March meeting, ideally, barring unforeseen circumstances. So any comments about that schedule?
And I think Edmund did send around some specific dates. I could try to go into my calendar quickly and find them.
That's okay. I think, yeah, we did get that. Yeah. Oh, Virginia printed it out. Good for her. Yeah. Okay. So you've all seen those. I mean, hopefully, if you haven't looked at those dates, please compare them to your calendar and make sure you're holding those dates. I think that's the most important thing. I think January 19th is the day I remember. So that's the next one to really stay on top of. And we'll figure out, you know, the timing once we know more what goes on the agenda. So our folks have any comments about that or any other suggestions about how to run the next few meetings? I mean, March would essentially be the opportunity to have deeper discussions because we'll have more time about potential new ideas. And maybe we'll even have a draft of the science needs assessment. I don't know, Steve, is that overly ambitious?
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute. Probably.
Okay. Just because I think it's going to codify a bunch of discussions that have been had about what science could be advanced to meet management needs. But of course, things do change. You know, a lot of those meetings were held in 2020, right? You know, crazy times. So I think, you know, it doesn't mean we're at all married to those ideas, but I do think it helps get the thought processes going to hear from at least some of the stakeholders about what they thought was important. Doesn't prevent us from suggesting other things. So, okay, well, seems like no one has any major objections to that schedule. Well, I think we'll be, you know, thinking about how to use those meetings effectively and probably trying to keep the virtual meetings to be not very long, just because it's tough to be online for long periods of time. So I think that's all I have on this agenda item. I propose we move to the next item, which is Edmund summarizing.
Yeah, but we do have a public comment.
Oh, we do. Okay. I
Yep.
wasn't sure if I needed to do that here. Okay, please go
Yep.
ahead.
We have a public comment from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say, I anxiously watch the sewer shed data in Sacramento when you guys have in-person meetings. And Lisa, I wanted to send you a link to it, but there are issues with people getting long COVID and it causing cognitive deficits. And I just want to say, all of your brains are like a statewide asset at this point. And I really, so I think that should be a consideration. That's all. I'll send you the link. Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, yes, well, that is part of the reason to push the in-person meeting to March, when hopefully some of these viruses will have calmed down a bit. So planning is different in this day and age. All right, so let's go ahead and move to agenda item 9, which is a recap of what is happening.
Yes, so there are 3 major follow-up items from this meeting. First off, Lisa, you provided an overview of the revised proposal. Based on the discussion, there'll be some potential revisions. The second one is today, Tanya made a motion with a second from Virginia to approve the content of the draft EIR review with modifications that were discussed today. The motion passed by all ISB members present. The only one that wasn't present was Tom. There are 2 follow-up items in terms of writing for the review. Obe was going to look into section 4.6 to better describe changing hydrological processes and warming conditions. And Inga was also going to help write up the section about contaminants and inadequate data. But other than that, Steve and Lisa will make modifications from today and submit to DWR by December 16th, along with the transmittal letter. And then the third follow-up item is that individual leads to start thinking about work planning for 2023 and submit major milestones for discussion in January. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think I also was hoping that Anna would be willing to rewrite that section that she saw as a 3-part thing, because I wasn't sure I saw it as clearly as her.
Okay.
Yeah, so section 4.3, I think I'd have to go back to the document to see the number.
Okay.
And so just to be clear, the timing wise, the document needs to be sent in its final form by December 16th. So Lisa, by what date would you need input from those of us who are contributing pieces?
Let's ask Edmund.
Would Monday work?
This coming
Sure. Yeah. End of the day on Monday, yes?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, any other additions or comments? I muted without meaning to. Okay, hearing no comments, we'll move on to our final agenda item, which is, do we have any public comments that are for things not on the agenda?
Yes, from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to send you a few references on watershed drying, which might just be for future reference. What should I send that to the whole Delta ISB, or I could send it just to Obe?
Probably best to send things to Edmund or the general email, and then Edmund can make sure it gets to the right people.
Okay, thank you.
No additional public comments.
Okay, well, thank you, Deirdre, for making us aware of that research. Well, some people may already know. I don't want to speak again for everyone here, but for making me aware of that research. Okay, well then I think we are done. Any other comments? All right, hearing none, I adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Have good
you.
holidays.
Yeah, enjoy the holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.